All right. Welcome back to Organizational Assessment for Risk Mitigation. We have two different speakers with us today, Sue Buckley and David Tucker. They are actually hiding on your panelist screen under one name, but we actually have the expertise of both. I'm actually not going to spend a whole lot of time belaboring a little bit on the introduction for them, because you've probably seen a fair amount of both David Tucker and Sue Buckley out in the field. They have done several different presentations and guides through both the Community Action Partnership and through NASCAS. And Mr. Tucker has also been at all different levels of the CSBG network. He has been both director of a local community action agency as well as with the state of Vermont. So well-versed in CSBG and in community action. So with that, I'm actually going to just hand it on over, let you guys get started for the day. We are going to open up our first poll momentarily, and that again will appear on that right-hand side of your screen. So we do appreciate that. While we're getting kicked off, you'll have a few minutes to get in your answers. Take it away, Sue and David.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. David and I look forward to talking with you today about risk management, the what, the why, the how, and the who. So we're going to talk about what is a risk assessment anyway, why would you do a risk assessment, some risk management techniques, and the role of the board, senior staff, and program directors in risk management. So we're going to do an overview of it, and then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts. So as an agency, what kind of things can you be doing? What kind of practices can you adopt to address the risk assessment, manage the risk in your agency?
So hello everyone, this is David Tucker, and I guess before we get started into sort of the nuts and bolts, we wanted to have you think about risk assessment in a different way. As a hypothetical, let's say you've been asked to join the board of a local nonprofit, and that particular agency's mission is closely aligned with your community action agency's mission, and it has been a strong advocate for its clients. However, it has a somewhat checkered history, and word on the street is that they're on shaky ground with several of the funding sources. But you've been asked to sit on the board, and I guess I'd like you, using the chat feature, and since you've got the question and answers opened already, you all can multitask, so you will be graded on that. So if you could use the chat feature, what kind of questions should you ask before deciding to join this board? So this is a board, again, that has some murky history to it and rumored to have some problems, but you've been asked to join the board. What kind of questions would you want answered before you decide to join the board? And we'll give you a couple of minutes or so to type in your questions. So why don't you, while you're busily typing away, we'd like to talk a little bit about really what is risk management. It's really trying to take a look at what kind of threats might be facing the organization, taking a look at what's the likelihood that individual threats might occur, and what actions do we need to take to prevent those threats. So it's really identifying, analyzing, and really managing the threats that could damage or put the agency at risk.
So you might ask, well, how do we do that? And the way that you do it is through a risk assessment, which is a process that you look at to identify the risks to your agency, and then you rate the risks. And so we'll be talking more about that today, but figuring out, well, that risk is there, but, you know, how risky is it? You know, you're going to be thinking about your funding environment, community perception, the changing demand and need for services. So we'll go through things, those kind of topics with you today.
So the kind of risk that you should be looking for really include a fairly wide variety. You know, most obvious is fraud, which can take many different kinds of forms, some general and some specific, like bank fraud, insurance fraud, forgery, things like that. And the elements of fraud as a crime similarly vary. The requisite elements of perhaps the most general form of criminal fraud, theft by false pretenses, are the intentional deception of a victim by false representation or pretense, with the intent of persuading the victim to part with property, and with the victim parting with the property in reliance on representing or pretense, and with the perpetrator intending to keep the property from the victim. In other words, lying to someone so that you can take some of their property or something of value from them. There's also internally the misuse of assets. If the executive director or senior staff are using credit cards to make personal purchases. There's also internally inadequate monitoring or understanding of investments. If an agency is lucky enough to have some sort of an investment place to keep unrestricted dollars, if they have been given an endowment or some bequeathed sum of money, the agency needs to make sure that they are monitoring how those investments are performing, make sure that they're keeping track of what's happening with the investments. So also, another form of risk is incomplete, unreliable, or improperly reported information. So if boards really aren't informed as what's going on financially with the agency, for example, that fiscal and or program reports may be just really brief, cursory, and the presentation's always upbeat no matter what's going on. And if the board asks questions, they're sort of turned away, rebuffed, or redirected. Also, damage to the agency's reputation. Any of the things that I've talked about up above can make the reputation of the agency questionable. How did that happen? What else might they be doing? Like the agency that has asked you to join the board, there are some rumors and word on the street that, you know, things might not be all copacetic at the agency. And there's also, sort of finally, is the violation of legal requirements, violating contracts, misappropriation of funds, misuse of funds, commingling of funds, things like that. So operating in a way that's in violation of contract requirements.
So before I do anything, I always want to understand why. So why do I need to do this? Is this just another one of the latest management lingo kind of things, or why? Well, there's many different reasons to do that, and let's go through those, and we'll talk more about them. The first is that the Office of Community Services has put out an Information Memorandum 112, which talks about risk assessment and the importance of that. The proposed CSBG organizational standards also address risk assessment. Again, and we're going to need to be doing that. Best practices in your agency is to be able to know what's going on. Are we at risk? Are we not at risk? You want to be able to answer the questions. And, you know, what we kind of chuckle and we say, no, thank you. We don't want our name to be in the paper.
Right. So the first thing that Sue mentioned is in IM 112, which is an Office of Community Service Information Memorandum, and it really talks about how a risk assessment can help you identify areas of weakness, areas that need to be strengthened in order to minimize risk to the agency. So it talks about how you should really take an overview of the agency, see where there may be areas that you should be concerned about, and how to strengthen those areas.
So IM 112 talks about, you know, having to have a risk assessment. A few years ago, all agencies were required to complete a risk assessment, and they were given to the state. I don't know if you folks all remember that. And they were trying to get a handle, the Office of Community Services, on the number of agencies in crisis and trying to determine what supports would be helpful to give to the agency so that they can be successful. Because one thing that we do know is that when an agency engages in high-risk behavior and has difficulty, it does reflect on the whole network. We see that all the time. And so you're going to be looking at, are there previous audit or monitoring findings? You know, if there have been material weaknesses, reportable conditions, question costs that have been going on and on, that's a real red flag. Going to be looking at internal controls. Are there policies and procedures in place to ensure that the assets and information are protected against fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement of federal funds? Statutory and regulatory compliance. You've got the CSBG Act that you're having to be in compliance with, and you've got Office of Management and Budget, OMB cost principles, so you want to make sure that you're in compliance there. And then you've got grants. And so now auditors are taking a look more at grants and seeing if they're, the agency is in compliance. So that's another really important piece. And then there's equipment and property, and the CSBG Act is really clear about how funds can be spent around equipment and property. So it's important to look at that and make sure that you're in compliance with all of those areas.
So let's look a little bit more in depth about what the IM says about risk assessment. It really talks about internal controls, which Sue has mentioned. Not being really a one-time event, but really a culture or a series of actions and activities that really happen throughout the organization, throughout the operations, and on an ongoing basis. And internal controls really aren't just you know, two people sign a check, or the same person who makes the bank deposit doesn't balance the checkbook, things like that. But internal controls really is something that happens throughout the organization, that there's a culture of risk reduction and mitigation, a culture that actively seeks to prevent fraud and abuse, and which really tries to engage in agency-wide commitment to compliance and the sound stewardship of organizations. So it's really looking at what is the culture of the organization, and does that support doing business in a completely transparent manner? Is it open, honest, and straightforward?
So the words transparent and culture are going to be words that you're going to be hearing throughout that those are really key pieces to risk management. So another reason why we're looking at risk assessments and risk management is we have the proposed CSBG organizational standards. And standard 4.5 says that an organization-wide risk assessment has been completed within the past 2 years and reported to the governing board. So the board is taking on a responsibility in this and needs to be aware. And with public, you just have to make sure that the department complies with the local government's risk assessment policies and procedures. But part of the culture of risk mitigation includes a regular review of the risk facing the agency and an analysis of how to best reduce those risks.
So what does that culture look like? Well, it's more, you can see on the screen there's a listing of all kinds of components of that, all kinds of things. But really, the culture of risk mitigation and really openness and transparency is more than just this checklist. You could have a conflict of interest statement, a code of ethics policy, a whistleblower policy. The board evaluates the CEO, personnel policies, et cetera, et cetera. You could check all of those off, but it's really more than that. It's really talking about using these documents as part of a framework for an agency's culture of risk avoidance and risk reduction. And really looking out from a real risk management perspective, is the board actively involved in creating and maintaining that culture? Does the board really want to make sure that they understand the financial reports, that they understand the programmatic activities that the agency is involved in, that they are really involved in an awful lot of the culture within the organization, that the agency knows what risks it's taking and is managing those risks and is doing everything it can throughout the organization to make sure things are open and transparent.
So when you start rating risk, there's some different considerations to think about. The first is the culture of the organization. And so what I mean by that is, you know, if it's sometimes we go into organizations where there's a couple people who are kind of in control of the organization. So it's kind of secretive, and those couple people have all the information, but so nobody else, you know, kind of knows what's going on, and they're wondering. Another one to think about is the history of compliance. So if there have been a number of issues over time that the programs aren't in compliance with their grants, or the audit has a lot of issues, that's a red flag. That's something that needs to be looked at. You know, the policies to guide practice. It's really important that there are policies and procedures, and that more importantly, perhaps, or just as importantly, is that all staff are informed and aware of those policies, and that they know how to follow and what they need to do. And David mentioned before the internal control. So we need to make sure that there's controls in place so that one person or two people don't have control over, you know, the financial information coming in. And then the intent. You're looking at, is this purposeful, or sometimes things just happen, but it's important to look at the intent.
So one of the questions that Sue mentioned is really, what is the agency's history of compliance? Have there been any reportable conditions in the agency audits during any of the past 3 years? And reportable conditions are any significant deficiencies in the design or operation of internal controls that could adversely affect the fairness of the financial statements. And the organizational standards talk about what agencies need to be doing in order to respond to any reportable conditions. They need to be assessed and addressed where the governing board has deemed it appropriate. So it's really part of that culture, but it's sort of a specific action that the board takes in response to any sort of audit findings like that. That if audit findings appear year after year and aren't sufficiently addressed, that really places the agency at risk on a whole lot of different levels. So that's really part of looking at the agency's history of compliance. We would also look at sort of what's the agency's history of compliance in terms of grants and contracts. Our monitoring reports coming back from funding sources that have repeated deficiencies or repeated findings. So what kinds of history does the agency have in meeting financial standards and in grant compliance?
So along those lines, there's more standards that address some of the concerns, and one of them is 8.9, which talks about the fiscal policies that have been reviewed by staff within the past 2 years and updated as necessary, with changes approved by the governing board, and that there's a written procurement policy in place that's been reviewed by the board. And I think that you probably all have seen more and more emphasis coming on the role of the board. The board's really having to take on more responsibility or assume more responsibility. Often it's been they've just kind of let the executive director lead them. But all these standards and best practices now are saying that isn't always working, and that certainly isn't best practice. So, you know, there has to be good policies in place, but the board needs to know about them and make sure that those are being followed.
Another question you should be really taking a look at is that do you have in place sort of the basic standard financial and operating controls to protect against fraud, abuse, and waste? Do you have the board approve fiscal policies and procedures? And do you have folks on the board who have the fiscal background and wherewithal to know the adequacy of those policies and procedures? Is there a whistleblower policy in the agency? Does staff know that they can speak out if they see fraud, abuse, or waste, and not have retribution for doing that? Is there a board ethics policy that the board reviews? And I think, you know, our recommendation for best practices is that be reviewed by board members and signed on an annual basis, so that board members are aware of what the ethics policy is and can confirm that they're not engaged in unethical or activities which create a conflict of interest. And does the board really assure that the annual audit is completed in a timely manner? And that's a board responsibility to make sure that's done, and that the board establishes a relationship with the audit firm.
All right, so now we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts. So one of the things we've talked about is, you know, are you in compliance with your grants and contracts? Well, how do you know that? So the first thing is a quality assurance process. And agencies do it differently. So we've been starting to see more and more agencies having a quality assurance person on staff, certainly some of the bigger agencies, and that can be the same as a grants manager. Some of them are separate, but having a position like that available. And that part of their role includes reviewing customer files on a regular basis to make sure that the mandated documentation and/or eligibility is available, that there's program evaluation done, customer satisfaction. Those are really important. And the grants manager role is to assure that the grant is implemented as written, that the documentation is available, and that reporting is done in a timely manner and as mandated by the funder. I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but I've had key managers leave a position and everything seemed to be under control, and then suddenly you start finding out that the reports weren't quite right, or the grant was supposed to be done this way and it was being done another way. So it's really important that someone is on top of that information. And that reports, excuse me, are thoroughly reviewed and questions are asked, whether they be to the, the program manager, to the supervisor, to the executive director, to the board. They're not just a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper. They've really got to be reviewed and questions asked to make sure that that progress is being made, outcomes are being met, and you're in compliance.
And sort of going beyond that, how do you know that your services and programs are of high quality? Do you review outcomes and adapt? Sort of a Roma principle, maybe. Do you get customer satisfaction surveys and feedback? Do you know how your customers feel that they are being treated and how services are delivered and what needs remain unmet? And are you incorporating new strategies to achieve old goals? Again, the leadership and board expectation should be that programs are meeting their outcome targets, and if not, what adaptations are being made to make them more responsive. So again, it's really the culture of the organization. It has to be transparent and one that is willing to look at results and activities with a discerning eye and trying to make corrections and improvements whenever necessary. So we've asked you sort of how you know that you're in compliance, but the key here is to put it into practice. We're going to go through now some of the responsibilities of the board, the chief executive officer or executive director, and program managers. The key that we want to emphasize is really to develop systems that assure that risk assessment is taking place and that risk management occurs throughout the organization.
Okay, so let's start with the role of the board. The role of the board is really key to risk management. They should control the environment. They're responsible, and they need to make sure that there are policies and procedures that, fiscal, personnel, administrative, that are reviewed, updated by managers, and them on a regular basis. They really need to know. They need to get the reports, as I mentioned earlier, and discuss them, not just, have it in the minutes that David submitted the CSBG report and they accepted it. Well, are outcomes questioned? Are they really looking to see, what's happening here? And there has to be a culture that encourages staff to report concerns without retaliation. There's the whistleblower policy, and we know that that's really challenging, that can be in place, but people are still afraid. So it's part of the culture that it really needs to be accepted that, staff need to report concerns and there can't be a retaliation of those.
So again, it's really important for the board to promote, establish, and reinforce not just do we have all of these documents, do we have the policies that we need and we can check off this checklist of documents, but the board really needs to make sure that these policies and procedures are being followed and that they're involved in making sure that the needs assessment and planning is done, the board composition is compliant with the CSBG Act, that those compliance kinds of things are being attended to. And more importantly, that the culture of the organization is one that seeks to manage funds effectively, promote effective programming and quality programming, and that steps are taken throughout the organization to make sure that fraud, abuse, and waste is not occurring.
So another role of the board is to have full financial oversight of the organization. So there needs to be finance and audit committees that know what's going on. They need to, the whole board needs to review the performance of the finance and audit committees. And some, boards don't have those kind of things or just starting to pull that together, but that's a key part. Another one is to review the annual budget. And lots of agencies don't do annual budgets, which will be mandated, but they really need to look at that carefully, or at least some astute board members. Every board should have some astute financial managers on board so that they know what they're looking at and can really understand what they're reading. Financial statements need to be reviewed. A red flag is when you get one that's on an Excel spreadsheet that, somebody should know that that isn't workable. It needs to come through the agency financial software. And that they review the annual independent audit to see are there findings, that kind of thing.
So one of the things that's important for a board to have in place is a finance committee that does include those fiscally astute board members. And the finance committee can really help the board's work by carefully reviewing monthly financial statements, really review the agency budget in a draft form and check that against board policy and strategies. If we have a strategic plan that says we're going to do A, B, and C and we only have funding for A and B, it's important for the finance committee to raise that as an issue early on so folks can discuss that and find out why those budget decisions are being considered. And they should make a recommendation for the annual budget to be presented to the full board. And they should work with management and really review management's recommendations for addressing any financial challenges that might be occurring, and they should really make their recommendations to the full board. It's important for the finance committee to review cash management policies, make sure the agency is managing cash effectively, not over-reliance on lines of credit, and the agency has a strategy for managing cash flow issues, and really take a look at if the agency is, in addition to lines of credit, if the agency is looking at borrowing other funds for other purposes and make those recommendations to the full board. So it's important, I think, for a finance committee to work closely with the executive director and chief financial officer, but they shouldn't have full and complete and utter faith in them, that they should really be able to analyze decisions that have been made or recommendations that the agency administration are making and really engage in a constructive dialogue with management of the agency to make sure, again, that culture of transparency and openness and a culture of risk management is being followed.
So another role of the board often is to be a check signer. At least there are two signatures on the checks. And it's really important that in assuming that role, that it's not just a quick sign-off. I've often seen board members with a whole pile of checks before a board meeting, just signing and signing and signing, and not really looking at the documentation to verify that there's proper approvals, there's the consistency in the payee and amount, and it's reasonable. So it's important that board members assume that responsibility and understand that and refuse to sign if they can't get their questions resolved. And if there's a repeated pattern of this, it's important to go to the audit committee to find out, what's going on, what are some next steps, what are they seeing, and reporting the concerns.
Many agencies, the audit committee is the finance committee, but in some agencies there is a separate committee that is the audit committee, and they really look at making the selection of the auditor, that the auditor works for the board. They're clear that the auditor works for the board and not for the chief financial officer or not for the executive director, that the main relationship and communications with the auditor and the agency is with the board, that they need to be in close contact and have a good relationship with the auditor. The audit committee should review any audit findings and be able to have a confidential discussion with the auditor about the status of the agency, any weaknesses that the auditor may see, what the audit findings may mean, other things like that. And that the finance committee / audit committee should be able to make recommendations to the board and to the management regarding those audit findings. So, you know, it's important, again, and we've said this before, but I'll say it one more time, it's really important to have people on the audit and or finance committee who have some fiscal expertise and who are able to raise questions and you know, have some in-depth discussions about the finances of the organization.
Another role of the board is around investment oversight. Well, that might seem a little far-fetched, but for some agencies that's real, especially folks who are doing entrepreneurial things or have housing projects. But the board needs the expertise, or to find it, to work in partnership with the CFO to assure that there are policies that govern, you know, how the income will be reinvested, how it will be taken out, and how performance will be reviewed. And then, you know, reviewing the performance of the investment managers and selecting the investment managers to make sure that there's a person who can work in the best interest of the organization.
So I think that, you know, really good boards really understand their role in sort of overseeing risk management throughout the organization, that they need to really work with management to make sure there is an agency-wide risk assessment conducted, and that they really talk with management about, well, what kind of risk can we tolerate? Do we take on a new program or endeavor that has high risk, but we have very little expertise in doing? Is it worth the risk? To really talk about those kinds of things, and review sort of what management has decided to do to sort of mitigate risks. What kinds of steps has the agency taken to lessen the level of risk throughout the organization? Does the agency have adequate insurance coverage? And have they really talked about, as a whole board, risks that are being taken by the agency which may not have been adequately mitigated but may be worth the risk? Is it worth discussing this? So it's really important that the board sort of step out of sort of nuts and bolts kinds of things to, again, make sure this culture of risk management and risk mitigation occurs, and that they really oversee that culture continues to function throughout the organization.
So the board is also responsible for looking at the compliance and making sure that any findings that have been found are corrected. So, you know, some boards have a committee responsible for compliance oversight or establish it through a charge of a different kind of committee. But, you know, the lingo now about the dashboards, that the compliance really needs to be on the dashboard. Reviewing the compliance findings in independent audit or monitoring reports. So those need to come to the board, and the board needs to know that those have been addressed. When you're, you know, year after year finding the same things, I mean, that's going to be your risk assessment's going to show a real issue here. And that they monitor the progress in resolving the findings and improving compliance. Figure, why did we get here, and what do we need to do to resolve this in the future? A lot of it is around systems. You know, again, do we have those compliance people in place, quality assurance people, grants manager, who are responsible for all of this? But the board needs to make sure that it's happening. It's not just totally depending on the executive director. They need to follow up. It's a dashboard to keep on top of what's happening.
So you might think with all of those roles and responsibilities of the board that there's not much left for the executive director or senior management to do. But there are a couple of things that we'd like to talk about that is clearly within the role and realm of the CEO or executive director. And they also play a critical role in maintaining a control environment, an internal control environment. that they make sure that written fiscal and operational policies and procedures are developed, updated, and provided to staff. They make sure that there's training provided to staff when there are additions to changes in policies or procedures, or when there are new staff coming on board, that new staff understand what those policies and procedures are and how the control environment works within the agency. And that they make reviews at the program or at the functional level, that they take a look down through the organization to make sure things are operating as they're supposed to, that there are controls in place, that people are following those policies and procedures, and that they really take a look at the performance indicators. That is, the agency producing the kind of outcomes that the agency intended to. Are we performing at the level that we had intended to? And the Chief Executive Officer and senior management should make sure that the board receives information on a regular basis in a form that is readable to them. I mean, I've seen, and I know Sue has too, we've seen board reports that are, well, they're just long, detailed, and pretty confusing. And it's really important for the executive director and senior staff at the agency to make sure that the information that boards get is in a format and in a way that boards can understand and digest and discuss with staff about.
So for just a second, I'm going to ask you to remember the question at the beginning. David asked that you were going to be asked to join a board of a local nonprofit, and he asked you to think about what questions should you ask before deciding to join the board. So we want you to keep putting in the questions you would ask, and maybe as we've gone through this a little more, you have more questions. But I'd like you to, keep thinking about what questions would you ask if you were being asked to go onto a board, and put those into the chat feature, your questions. Thank you. All right, so the CEO, the senior management have a lot more jobs and roles, as you know. One of them is to develop controls over the information processing and IT, and we know that that's IT information processing is getting more and more complicated all the time, and so it's critical that there be policies and procedures and control over how information is accessed and shared, that type of thing. Ensure that there is proper execution of transactions and events. So is everything being documented, being followed? Does the board know, that they've approved these policies and procedures, that they're working? Segregation of duties. And this can be really difficult in smaller agencies where, there's one person who opens the mail and maybe is going to deposit the checks, that kind of thing. But figuring out, who's signing the check request, shouldn't be getting it, different little segregation of duties so one person doesn't have all their authority and responsibility. Accurate and timely reporting of events is really important. And access restrictions and accountability for resources and records. And we talked a little bit about that through the IT, but really thinking there's more and more people are going to electronic, but there still are records that might not be available electronically and other resources that you have to monitor access to it so that everybody in the whole agency doesn't have access to things that they don't need to have access to.
So something that we've talked a little bit about before, but really falls under the purview of the executive director and senior management, is really transparency. It's information flow and communication throughout the organization. Are there monthly financial reports at the program and organizational level? Do you look at program accomplishments at the program and agency-wide level? Do program managers have access to operational and financial data as needed for planning and oversight? Do fiscal staff and program managers meet on a regular basis to review budgets, to make sure spending is occurring as it should, to make sure reports are sent in on time? Is there a real atmosphere within the organization that if something isn't going right, that isn't nearly as much of a problem as if nobody knows something is going wrong and it isn't being dealt with. Is there that kind of a culture of information within the organization? And are there structures, policies, and procedures in place to encourage open communication through all levels of the organization? Staff need to know what's going on in the organization, need to know how they can contribute to that, and they need to know what to do in case things aren't going well and they have some concerns.
So this is CEO, senior manager job just doesn't stop. So another part is monitoring of information. You know, looking at, you know, what does our grant say we're going to do? What is the, you know, planned program, financial activity, you know, we're supposed to be doing to the actual. That program managers need to be reviewing it, top managers need to be reviewing it, and then the board. Again, everybody needs to be transparent, as David said, and open. And there, you know, the system for tracking, monitoring, and audit findings, and you know, keep going back to systems, because a lot of this is about systems, having policies and procedure in place, following those, monitoring those, making sure that you're on top of things, that it isn't just a once a year we're going to have an audit, and so suddenly we start whipping out the records of everybody and try to figure out what isn't there and try to create records. That's not what we're talking about. This is ongoing process. There's, you know, the responsibility for resolving all the findings, and, you know, somebody knows who's responsible to do that. That needs to be reported to the board, as we talked about on the dashboard, but that means somebody needs to be on top of that. What's the system? Is it part of the senior leadership team meeting, you know, every other week, where it's discussed, you know, this is what the findings were, or this is what we learned, and this is how we're correcting it, or this is the help I need in order to do that. But there has to be a process in the system for doing that. And then, you know, verification of the financial and program data report. So, you know, is what you're seeing in the database matching up what you're seeing in the IS report? Sometimes that doesn't match up, and you're like, well, wait a minute, where did you get these numbers? How is that working? So it's important that information be corrected or connected, and so you make sure that they're all together having the same numbers. And, you know, financial information, you need to know that, you know, what's being put in is accurate.
So so as we talked about a little earlier, is that we've, you know, really talked about a culture throughout the organization of risk management, transparency, and openness. And so the role of program managers is also important to ensuring that that culture is spread throughout the whole organization. And that's really where risk management starts. You know, instead of the buck stops here, the buck really starts here. This is where program managers need to make sure that grants are being implemented as written and that agency policies and procedures are being followed when implementing that. And they need to be able to and feel free to report to senior management on compliance with grants and contracts and make sure that agency policies and procedures are being followed.
So the program manager is the day-to-day and is seeing what's going on, and often they're going to review the personal activity reports of the employees that they supervise, which is really important. Because one area of risk that can be seen is the falsification of time and maybe charging personal items to the agency. So it's important that the program manager, who's going to know that, can oversee it. There was something in Vermont where one of the state police was falsifying his time, and it was able to do it subtly, and nobody was picking up on it until, you know, somebody astute started looking and said it didn't make sense. And that happens everywhere, including in community action. So it's important just to make sure that, you know, the activity reports are matching up with what people are actually doing, and that the purchases that are being made are necessary, reasonable, and allowable. Grants are clear about what's allowable. But if somebody is going out and buying, you know, we saw computers and then taking them home, there's a question about that. So the role of the program manager is really to be on top of those things. They need to have access to the fiscal administrative policies and procedures so they can make sure what the agency policies are, that they're following those, and if there's any questions going back to them, and regularly training staff on them. And when someone comes in, a new staff person, part of the orientation process needs to be around reviewing the policies and procedures and the expectations. And then, any time that there's a change, all staff need to be made aware of that change so they can change their practices. And I think that one of the key things here, again, kind of goes back to the culture, is that there's a no tolerance message. It is important to minimize risk. This is not acceptable in our agency, and that starts at the board. It goes to the executive director, it goes to the senior manager, program managers, the whole agency. We have transparency, and that it is not acceptable to engage in risky behavior.
So how does a program manager really exercise that role? Two really good ways is to really take a look and review monthly service data and make sure it's complete and accurate. Are client contacts being recorded accurately and properly? Are we collecting the data that we're supposed to in a proper way? Do we have quality control in terms of data entry and service delivery? And also to review on a monthly basis fiscal data to ensure completeness and accuracy. As I think I mentioned before, sitting down, program managers and fiscal staff sitting down together, reviewing program budgets, making sure that there aren't mysterious charges on a particular program that the program manager can't identify or doesn't know what or how it has been charged to. It could be a mistake, but it could be it could place the agency at risk if charges were allocated to a program that are not allowable to that particular program. And a good program manager and a good system for those kinds of reviews are really sort of a good frontline defense against unnecessary risk to the agency.
Okay, so how do you diminish risk? I just talked a minute ago about the organizational culture that doesn't support risky practices. You make it clear that we're not going to tolerate that from the top down. We put segregation of duties policies in place. So again, we don't have the person opening the mail, depositing the checks, or the person doing a check requisition, then delivering the checks. So you're just taking away all kinds of temptation and possible risk by having clear policies about how those kind of things are done and distributed. That there's quality assurance in the workplace. And we talked before about whether it be a quality assurance person or a grants manager, some kind of a system that you're looking at the quality aspect of the work, and you're making sure that grants are being implemented, that outcomes are being achieved, or if not, something is being done about that. And with all of it, it is so critical that the board knows what's going on. If there's progress isn't being made, boards should be able to read the IS reports and ask questions. So they need to be actively involved, they need to be knowledgeable, they need to get information from staff so that they can do that. And when, as a board member, if you're sometimes getting the runaround, we've certainly seen having to be persistent, and when rebuffed, continue to request, saying, I don't understand that. And sometimes that's a difficult position to be in, but that's a really important role of the board.
And sort of another way to sort of manage risk is sort of step back and take a big picture look at risk, if you will. Avoid programs that pose too high of a risk, financial risk, lack of staff expertise. If you don't know much about housing finance or you don't have staff who are knowledgeable in housing policies and housing financing, you really want to be careful about jumping right into lots of different housing programs, for example. If you don't have staff expertise on substance abuse treatment, for instance, you probably don't want to offer a program that provides substance abuse treatment. So you really want to avoid programs that that pose a really high risk. However, you may have programs that do pose some risk, and you may want to hang on to those programs. But what's really important, I think, is for board and staff to really understand what that risk is. And if you decide to accept that risk, that everyone goes into it with open eyes or keeps their eyes open and understands that there may be a programmatic outcome or some tie into your mission that really makes that risk worthwhile to take. You can also maybe modify how you are doing a particular program or operation. You may need to change your procedures to really help to manage that risk. Or you can look to partnering with other agencies or organizations through contracts, insurance, memorandums of understanding, et cetera. So you can share that risk with another organization so that neither organization is taking too big of a risk or too big of a chance on operating a program or a service.
Okay, so we've gone through looking at, risk assessment, risk management, the different roles of the board, of the CEO, of the program managers, and kind of here David's talking about the big picture risk management. Well, now, it's like, okay, so if we want to do this, how do we do it? What about tools? So there are many risk assessment tools that are available, and part of it is you need to determine what's best for your agency. I mean, our recommendation is that that the assessment tool be comprehensive and cover the areas that we've highlighted today to make sure that you have internal controls. But there's also a good risk assessment toolkit that was completed for the Community Action Partnership and is on their website that includes a comprehensive risk assessment for use by the community action agencies. And so we'd recommend that you take a look at that also, that's a really, I think, a good comprehensive one. But you've got to look at, your agency and what, your concerns and figure out what best can help you to assess that. So now I'm going to give you one last chance to ask any questions. We're going to start looking at the questions that you were asked, and David has a little bit of a twist on it.
So at the beginning of the webinar here, I had you sort of think of what questions to ask if you were asked to join a board. Now I'd like you to sort of put the shoe on the other foot and think about a scenario where your board is considering a local banker to fill a recently vacated seat on the board, and the banker is asked to meet with you to get to know a little more about the agency before deciding whether or not to join the board. What questions should you be prepared to answer? Are they any different from the questions that you thought you should ask before joining a board? You've sent along, I think, some really good questions, and we have a few questions that we thought of, but let's look at some of the questions that you've asked. I would want to look at the last 5 years of audits. So that's something you might expect that banker to ask for sure. What funding source reviews have found? Explanation on any findings. Probably the banker would probably ask about that. So that's something you'd have to be prepared to answer. I want to look at financial policies and procedures. Yes, probably a banker would ask that of you, and you would want to ask that. What's your directors and officers' liability coverage? Also a good question. Is there insurance? What is my personal risk or liability on serving on the board? That would be your concern going onto a board, and probably would be the banker's concern coming onto your board. So that, again, would be a question you'd want to be prepared to answer.
Here's my answer. You are the 501c3. You are liable. People board training, when we do that, people don't believe that. But yes, you want to know what's in place, and do they have the D&O insurance?
And what is your programmatic reporting? What's the current amount of net unrestricted assets? And what were the results of the last audit? Yes, those are all terrific questions. And we have some questions that we've thought of. Let's see. Okay, we're going through the list here a little bit more. Who are the attorneys on the board? Are there attorneys on the board?
Very good.
Who leads the audit committee and what's their background? Probably the banker's angling for a seat on the audit committee and wants to make sure he or she can get on that committee. Yeah, some great questions. What's your experience with nonprofit organizations? Do you have any experience managing federal grants? So all good questions, I think, from either side, whether you're being asked to join a board or a board member is seeking to join your board. So we have a couple of questions that we thought of, too.
And I think here's the last question that came in. Agency's financial standing, that's a really good question. You want to know if they're, in bankruptcy, if they're going down, what risk are you taking? Any large-scale personnel problems. We've worked at agencies where the legal time in court's been phenomenal. And what do they see as the board members' responsibilities, which is a really astute question to ask, and hopefully the answer from your agency isn't you just need to go, come to a meeting 1 hour a month.
All of those are really great questions, and we just put together a few in preparation for this, and you've added some really excellent questions as well. And I hope that those questions sort of from both sides of the table, whether you're being asked to join a board or somebody else is asking to join your board, really helps you get sort of a sense of what risk management and risk mitigation is all about. It's being able to answer those kinds of questions that you listed and the ones that we have on the screen here as well. It's really being in a position where you'll be able to answer any and all of those questions with really confidence and pride in your agency, that you have that culture of transparency, that you have a culture of risk mitigation and risk aversion and risk management throughout the organization. So if you have that kind of a system in place, this banker or the attorney who wants to join the board who's very skeptical, you'll be able to answer those questions and really not have to worry that, there are things that you haven't dealt with and that you can accept someone onto the board knowing that you're not placing them at risk because the agency isn't at risk.
All right, so any questions on your end that you have for us? We've completed our presentation and would be happy to answer any questions. We do have poll questions that are asking you a pre and post, so we'd like you to fill those out. But are there any other questions in the meantime that we could answer for you? We're going to be looking at the chat feature here.
Sure, and to ask your questions, everyone, you can use the actual Q&A box function to put those in. Again, select all panelists, or you can use the chat window, either one, and of course encourage you to get those in. And as I mentioned, we do have the poll questions back open. Those should look familiar. They are the same questions we did at the beginning. We'll be looking just kind of at these answers as a whole to try to, part of our evaluative process of the webinar. So I do encourage you to put your questions in. I will answer one of the ones that I have seen come up a time or two, which is, yes, this is recorded, and yes, the presentation materials will be available. We will be putting those on the TNTA Resource Center at www.csbgtta.org, as well as on the partnership's website. So you can use those to get a review there. We seem to have a relatively quiet audience today. Well, we can leave those poll questions open for a few more moments while we're finishing up then. And of course, if you think of questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at the partnership. I put my email address at the beginning of the webinar into that chat window, so you can find us after the fact. We will be glad to answer questions, forward them to Sue or to David, and get you answers there. So it's not your last opportunity to engage with this material and to ask questions. There will be an evaluation that will pop up when the webinar ends today. So we do appreciate your attention to that. Get to let us know what you thought about today's event, as well as give us some ideas of what else you'd like to see out of the partnership. So while we see if there's any last second questions that come in, are there any closing words that you would like to leave us with?
I'd just like to thank everybody for hanging in there. I mean, risk mitigation, talk about a thrilling topic for discussion on a nice afternoon here in the East anyway. I want to thank you all for hanging in there and hope the information was useful and something that you can make use of in your agency.
Thanks, everybody.
We did have one question that came in while you're still on the line. Can you give some examples of what a board member would be liable for in the operation of a nonprofit?
Well, I know the most glaring liability that I think is true in any nonprofit is if the agency fails to pay payroll taxes. I know that the IRS comes after individual board members for those payroll taxes. So that's something a lot of board members, when they find that out, they always want to see, okay, so when were the payments made to the IRS? Have we made our payroll tax payments? I know that's one area that's pretty universal. And there are different liability laws in different states covering nonprofits. So it's real important, I think, to know sort of what your state's liability laws are and what the coverage is for your officers and directors insurance, and that'll really help board members understand what their individual liabilities are. So there's not one universal answer except that the IRS will find you. So that's something important to pay attention to.
Thanks. All right then. Well, with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day, and we will be in touch and hope to see you on several of our other webinars that are coming up in September. If there is interest out of this crowd, we are covering fiscal fundamentals for executive directors next Tuesday the 16th, as well as organization-wide budgets next Wednesday the 17th. So if either of those are of interest, you can register for those from the partnership's website as well. So everyone, if you'll have a great afternoon, we will close out for today. Thank you everyone for your attention and participation.
Thank you.
You could send them.
Still on.